Hello and welcome to Theology Deep Dive. My name is Patrice Petel, and today you can consider this episode as a kind of prolegomenon to my whole channel. Well, of course, it's not very sexy. Prolegomenon in systematic theology is not a very sexy subject, yet it is a very important one, very fundamental one. And today, this is what I want to do with this episode. Try to give you, my listeners, a kind of prolegomenon to my whole channel, to the way I approach theology, and to give us a little bit of an introduction of what is a prolegomenon. Let's look at this here for a second. So uh, if I look at this here, you can see that the prolegomenon. Let me just see if I can just put this a bit bigger here. So just a second there. So prolegomena is a Greek word that comes from the Greek prolego. Prolego is a compound word which means to say first. So prolegomenon is a bit like the first considerations when you do systematic theology, when you approach any subject, any which ways. Your basic presuppositions, your basic assumptions, what it is that you consider important as you approach theology or any other subject for that matter. But usually the word prolegomena is mostly used in the context of systematic theology. And so when I first started my readings in systematic theology, I remember I had this old, I think I got it here somewhere. Let me just see. Where is it? Oh, here it is. So this is volume one of my old Schaeffer, Louis Perry Schaeffer systematic theology. Um, and this volume, or the first volume is Prolegomena. And in this Prolegomena, Louis Perry Schaeffer gives his basic assumptions of his approach to systematic theology. So very soon, very early on, when I first studied this, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago, 30, yeah, 30 some years ago, uh, I did not know what this word prolegomena would mean. I'm French speaking, and I didn't connect with the word, the French word, which is a prologue. A prologue is the beginning of a book, the first consideration, the first words in a book, and I had not catch that prolegomenon was the Greek word corresponding to the French prologue. I think you have this also in English, a prologue. It's basically the same thing. So today, I want to make this a bit of a prolegomenon about about how I approach theology. And I think the first most important consideration, I think, is the notion of scripture in approaching theology. Because you see, there are many ways to approach theology. There is you can some people love historical theology. I must admit, I early on I was really fascinated by the early creeds, all the creeds of Christendom. I remember I had this upstairs in my personal library. I have my this series. I think it's Philip Schaff, that made a series on all the creeds of the Christian faith, and this book, it fascinated me early on. I didn't have that book early on. It was in my pastor's library, but I would often borrow, there's several volumes. I would often borrow this and just read the creeds and what they said and what they meant, and trying to figure out everything. Because where I lived, in which way, in Montreal, Montreal, Quebec. See, in Quebec, at that time, the evangelical population was very, very tiny. It still is, but by the state, at that time it was less than half of a percent. that were evangelical. So of course I did not have access to all the information, and there was no web, no internet, no nothing, just a tiny a tiny radio that was on the border between Quebec and the New York State, where they would broadcast evangelical content to try and reach the citizens in Quebec. The WCHP were trying to reach 7:60 a.m. Yeah, they were trying. I think that was the calling letters of WCHP. Yeah, and they were trying to reach Quebec population, so they had this portion in French and the whole of the rest portion in English. And my pastor had a radio program there. But this was the whole when I first got converted in the early 80s. It was the first content, evangelical content that I could get my hands on. There were no libraries, and my pastor had many books, but that was it. I could only borrow a few books sometimes when he didn't need them. But that's how I first got my hand on theology, and my very first theological way I made my teeth. I don't know if you listen in English. I made my teeth on Schaeffer. His early work was the first book of theology I read was his. I think it's in English. It's called Basic Bible Doctrines from Louis Perry Schaeffer. And I bought this. My brother-in-law at the time had this series, and he gave them to me. So I got this and just got dug into them to better understand, and it was fascinating to learn systematic theology. But all this to say that the first so there's historical theology, where you consider the historical development of the theological loci. Um, yeah, you can, according to different traditions, so Catholic traditions, Protestant traditions, Orthodox traditions, although Greek Orthodox are not that keen on systematic theology per se, they still do have a few works on it, and it's fascinating. But I fell in love with biblical theology. So the difference between biblical theology and systematic theology is that biblical theology, you look at the development of doctrine um, in a chronological order from Genesis to Revelation. So you find, let's say, a subject or a theme, a biblical theme like covenant, for instance, and you start going from the whole Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, on that theme, but chronologically. And very early on, I thought this was the best path to understand what Scripture thought, because I figured, and it didn't take me long to kind of, I would always check all the references that, for instance, Schaeffer, or I've got I think I have it right here, uh, a basic theology by Ryrie, and it didn't take me long to figure out that oftentimes when you look at the context, uh, you go through the theological passage, the content, and then you look at the passages, biblical passages. Didn't take me long to figure out that oftentimes the verses they quoted did have nothing to do. Same thing for Grudem. Grudem, I don't have it in. Now I have it in on my computer. But the same thing, oftentimes when you look up the passages and you study the context before, after, the context of the whole book, it has nothing to do with what it is supposed to prove, to support. And so I was really disappointed. The more I studied systematic theology, the more I was disappointed in it, because oftentimes it was like they had this doctrine, and they were looking around for little sound bites, scriptural sound bites that would agree with their theological musings. And so this really disappointed me early on, because I said, that doesn't seem right to me. That really doesn't seem right. But then I took I had a few books in biblical theology, And that's when I figured out that that's the best approach, possibly, to understand what the Bible is all about, the themes of the Bible. Go through it chronologically. And my thought was that if I can, let's say, I come upon a prophet like Isaiah. So in my mind, Isaiah had access to all the antecedent revelation, supernatural, like all of the antecedent revelation of Scripture, but not the following one. So that was in my mind, and I would always study Scripture by means of, well, try to study Scripture by means of biblical theology. I would use the systematic theology to help me to guide my thought, my thinking. But my most important, or my most the best way I found was through biblical theology. Because early on, I got the idea that if Scripture was not wholly true, then the Christian faith had no basis. And I will explore this later on in a few. I've got a few episodes thought out that I will look at this the inerrancy, the inspiration of Scripture. But suffice to say that in my approach of theology of the Christian faith, I take for granted, or I take as a basic presupposition, that Scripture is inerrant. Okay, I got some good reasons to believe this, but my main idea is starting with Scripture, and I do hold to Sola Scriptura, even though it's not sexy today to hold to Sola Scriptura. It's not sexy to hold to inerrancy today. Still, this is my starting point to my whole journey, and my hermeneutical approach, my basic tenet to approach Scripture. Well, years ago, I fell, one of my teachers, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, perhaps some of you know him. He's a Messianic Jew, my Messianic teacher, very, very uh, interesting fellow, uh, who's written quite a lot on the Messianic movement. But he would quote the golden rule of interpretation by Cooper. And this was, for years, this was my go-to rule for interpreting Scripture. Even when I taught, I used to teach at my church Bible college, the introduction to hermeneutics. I taught this for years. And the, my starting point, or the focus of my whole hermeneutical approach, was this golden rule of interpretation. And what it says is basically, when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. So this is really important. So let's go like this. I'm trying to over under to highlight this there. Oh well, yeah, there it is. So when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense, and therefore take every word at its primary, ordinary, usual, literal meaning, unless the facts of the immediate context, studied in light of related passages and axiomatic fundamental truth, indicate otherwise. So this for me was very important, but up to a point, because something that always bothered me in this definition, in this thing, was this part here. Studied in the light of related passages, I have no problem with this, but here was my problem. And axiomatic and fundamental truth indicate clearly otherwise. What truth can supersede scriptural truth? So I fell in love early on. I fell in love with this definition, or this methodological approach by David Cooper, on Scripture. And I do use this as my basic approach to Scripture. But my problem is with that little phrase there, axiomatic and fundamental truth. Because obviously, if you bring in, for instance, Calvinistic ideas, or if your ideology, so if you bring in Calvinist ideology and you force this in Scripture, and you say that those are the axiomatic and fundamental truths, then that breaks, that the whole definition breaks out, because this is the linchpin. This is the one aspect, the one point where the whole thing breaks down. If these fundamental truths, if these axiomatic aspects are not also grounded in Scripture, or at least compatible with Scripture, everything falls down. So early on, that was a real problem for me. So to better illustrate this, let's say that, let's just see here. So to better illustrate this, let me just take this here, and I'll draw you a bit of my how I approach Scripture. So let's say that, let's do this like here. So let's say that I have Scripture here. All right, and so this is the Bible, and of course there's the there. So this is my Bible here. How do I approach Scripture? Of course, there is, so Scripture is made of what? So Scripture is made of language. So obviously, to understand language, I must have a grasp of language. So language, the understanding of language, must precede my understanding of Scripture, or else I won't understand what Scripture means. So language is a fundamental principle that allows me, that guides me in my understanding of Scripture. Now, obviously, if my reasoning is bad, even if I try to have a good language for a nation, if my reasoning is bad, it doesn't serve anything. So reason and language are kind of basic in science. I think it's Kopersky that speaks in his book in one of his articles. He talks about meta-theoretic principles. Meta-theoretic, meta is mean above, theoretic, above the theory. So basic assumptions where you approach how you understand something, how you understand science, or things like that. So these meta-theoretic shaping principles, this is how Kopersky speaks of them, MSP, meta-theoretic shaping principles. So these shaping principles will actually shape how we approach a subject, how we think about a subject. So these are kind of operational assumptions that we use to approach something. So obviously reason, in my mind at least, so reason is highly important, okay, to approach Scripture. So how to think rationally. So the basis of logical thinking. So the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, and so on. So these are fundamental. And the laws of grammar and language. These are also fundamental, because if you don't understand language properly, I mean, you can't understand Scripture properly, because the whole idea of God inspiring authors to write something, the whole idea behind it is because you can't understand language. I think it was Francis Schaeffer that speaks that God is a God who speaks. He is there, and I think it was even the title of one of his books. He is there and he is not silent. He is communicating, which is why he made us communicating beings. And in that sense, I think that we are communicating beings. We are communicators, and we can understand God's communication to us. And so there is reason, there's language, and then there's another very important aspect, which is history. Because history, so language, I think this will work here. Yes. Language, history, and reason. These are the pillars of properly understanding Scripture. if anything of this is wrong, then there's a good reason to doubt the conclusion made in understanding Scripture. So, which brings me to the to a fundamental aspect of hermeneutics, which is called the historical and grammatical approach of hermeneutics. The historical and grammatical. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you can just put an O here in English, historical grammatical approach of Scripture. So you must ground in reason, so no contradictions, in language, so the rules of language, of linguistics, of semantics, of the whole set of tools one can use to properly understand language, be it philology, word study, all these kinds of things, and history. So when we do this, I think that we can properly understand Scripture. Because it's funny, because in when Francis Schaeffer spoke, he wrote a book. I've had it so long ago that I can't remember when he wrote it, but just pops into me. I think I took it out to show you better. So here in his book, The Great Evangelical Disaster, he will write, "Here is the great event." Oh, is that all right with you? Okay. "Here is the great evangelical disaster, the failure of the evangelical world to stand for truth as truth." So for me, this is fundamental to our approach of theology. There is only one word for this, namely accommodation. The evangelical church has accommodated the world spirit of the age. So the evangelical church has accommodated to the world spirit of the age. First, how was this done? There has been accommodation on Scripture, so that many who call themselves evangelicals hold a weakened view of the Bible and no longer affirm the truth of all the Bible teaches. Truth not only in religious matter, but in the areas of science and history. So can you imagine I'm wondering, you have so I have here, let me see if I can have the copyright here. So I don't have the copyright date for the great evangelical disaster, but it must certainly be in the 70s. So the complete work of Francis Schaeffer here, I think, dates from the 1982. So it was much prior to this. He wrote a book on the great evangelical disaster. But if you can get a hold of Francis Schaeffer's series of on his work, this guy was a thinker. He's a great mind, and so I think that the first accommodation to the world, the spirit of the age, there has been an accommodation on scriptures that many who call themselves evangelicals hold a weakened view of the Bible and no longer affirm the truth of all the Bible teaches, not only in religious matters, but also in the areas of science and history and morality. And to me, this is a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. And so he will write a bit later, this accommodation has been costly, first in destroying the power of the scripture to confront the spirit of our age, So this is very important. Second, in allowing the further skill, the further slide of our culture. And so, can you imagine? He wrote this. He wrote this in the. He wrote this in the 70s, maybe earlier. I'm not sure, but at least in the 70s or and the 80s, he published this complete works of Francis Schaeffer. How much more with the whole thing and with Basham's book about the uh, shepherds for sale. This is even more so today. And the more we go, the more we accommodate, and the less and less uh, truth the less and less value does the Bible have in our day-to-day walk as Christians. And for me, this is a terrible waste. There is no other foundation than Scripture. So I'll finish on this time, and next time we'll start to dig a little bit deeper in this whole subject of the importance of Scripture. May God bless you all.